Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Miles, and today I'm going to do a video talking about my most recent hospitalization. So in all actuality, I've sort of been avoiding this video because I knew I needed to talk about some things that I didn't really feel ready to talk about. But after having given it a little bit of time, I realized I better do it now before I forget anything important, so here we go. For those of you who don't know, I have a mental disorder called schizoaffective disorder. And that just basically means that I have schizophrenia mixed with bipolar type features. So along with having hallucinations, both visual and audio, I also experience some rapid ups and downs, and sometimes all of those symptoms come together to cause an episode like the one I just recently experienced. When this does happen, it is referred to as a psychotic break. With schizophrenia, this usually means that the sufferer experiences hallucinations and delusions that last far longer and can be way more intense than usual. For me, the way that this normally works is that I lose touch with reality and I begin to believe the delusion that I'm inside a dream, or rather a nightmare, and that nothing I see or experience around me is real, so nothing really matters. And the main driving force of this experience is to survive for as long as possible while finding a way to somehow break out of the dream. And for me, normally, I believe that that's best achieved by either dying or by drastically decreasing your life force. Normally to the point where it's just not sustainable to stay in the dream anymore. So then the idea is you pass from the dream. In my case, this normally looks like me starting to engage in a lot of self-harm repetitively day after day, just to keep conscious enough to keep going, and then making some sort of plan to either end my life or to seriously injure myself. But real quick, let's back up and talk about the signs of a psychotic break. So the first sign is delusions, which is basically ascribing to any belief that is not grounded in reality. For me, that's the idea that I'm living in a dream or a nightmare and nothing around me is real. The second sign would be hallucinating. So seeing or hearing things that aren't there and often contribute to or confirm the delusion that you're experiencing. So for me, I had some family members who were going through a bit of a rough time, so they were acting differently. And because they were acting differently, my brain said, that's not them. Therefore, this is a dream. They're not acting like they normally would. Therefore, this is a recreation. And that just furthered the belief that nothing was real. The next sign would be extreme anxiety. That would be becoming incredibly worried over situations that aren't based in reality, or becoming overly suspicious or extremely fearful of others. So during this time for me, I wouldn't get in cars with anybody because I didn't trust them, and I wouldn't have anyone over at my house, nor would I go out to any social events because I just did not want to be around people. I thought they were plotting against me and I needed to figure out this dream, this nightmare by myself. The next one would be disordered reasoning. So this is talking or acting in a generally disorganized manner, jumping between thoughts, pairing unrelated thoughts or experiences, and making little to no sense in what you share with others, whether that's verbally or in writing. For me, at this time, I had sent a lot of really weird texts to my friends, and I had been rambling about past dreams that I've had mixed with elements of what I thought was the current dream that I was having, and pretty much not making a lot of sense to any of them. But at the time, in my mind, I don't remember being confused. I just remember thinking, why can't they understand this? And that would just be generally part of that disordered reasoning. Then the very last sign can be catatonia, which some people experience and some do not. Basically what that is after or during a psychotic break or episode, your brain can slip into a self-saving state of unresponsiveness. The best way to describe this one for me would be kind of just like pushing the off button on a robot. I will get stuck in a certain place in a particular position, and then I will not move or speak or open my eyes or interact or respond to the world around me. Now, during this time for me, I can normally hear what's going on. I just don't have the ability to kind of be present in my body to do anything about it. And so just recently, I believe it was the second week of July, I had basically checked all of these boxes off. I was experiencing all of these symptoms. I had stopped believing that I was living in reality, and I did think that it was a nightmare, and I knew that I had to do something about it to get out of it. And it was because of all these things that one afternoon when I had not eaten or drank anything all day and I fell into a state of catatonia, my parents decided to call an ambulance. And when it comes to people like me, that is followed by, or rather preceded by, law enforcement. Because of how volatile I can be when I'm in a state like that. Law enforcement will generally arrive first and either attempt to put you in cuffs or give their assistance to the responding EMTs on the scene. This will have been my second hospitalization where law enforcement was involved, and unfortunately, as much as they try to help, they really do often end up making things a lot worse. But more on that later. For the time being, I will kind of just walk through the process of what happened when they arrived and then after we all left together. So during the time that this all went down, I had been outside because I did not feel right indoors. So I had stayed outside for a couple hours at that point and became catatonic outside in one of my lawn chairs. And because of this, my parents had decided to make the call to EMS and law enforcement because I had not eaten or drank anything all day. It was very hot outside and they were concerned that I was beginning to overheat. Now, normally for me, I will get into a catatonic state, and then when anyone attempts to move me, as in pick my body up and place my body anywhere, I kind of just, there's two modes, either fight or flight, and because you really can't flee from a situation like that, my body goes straight to fight mode. This is something that I have no control over, and I can still be inside my head in the background, listening to and hearing what's going on, but I'm not in the front of my mind where I could say, no, I'm not going to hit this person. No, I'm not going to bite this person. My body is just in full-on panic, and I really have no control over it. And this is exactly what happened when the EMTs who arrived on the scene teamed up with the cops who had been there and attempted to remove me from the lawn chair and then get me onto a stretcher. I don't personally have a lot of memory of that time. I remember it sort of starting, and then I recall being able to hear things, but I wasn't present in the front of my mind in the sense that I could tell you where people were standing or where we were positioned. Normally my eyes are closed during this process, or they're half lidded and I just can't see anything. So that definitely escalated the situation, and I'm told it took 6 to 7 people just to keep me on the stretcher and then even begin to attempt to restrain me. And that entire time, their cops were involved and were trying to muscle me into submission, and the EMTs were all struggling to try to restrain me, and there was talk of sedating medication before we got into the ambulance, so it was an all-out brawl and it was not pretty. I see things slightly different in that I felt like I was a victim. I felt like I was being manhandled, but everybody there at the scene was able to reciprocate the idea that that was not the case. I was giving them a very hard time. I had bitten multiple people. I had kicked people. It was just pure panic. And that they were really struggling with what they wanted and needed to do, which was get me into the ambulance and to the ER, and then concurrently after that to the psych ward. But keeping things brief, they were able to finally get me into a pair of hard restraints, and then we got into the ambulance. During the time in the ambulance, I was so upset that they couldn't really attempt to take my vitals. They were having a hard time getting a blood sample. And then when they attempted to offer me some oxygen as I was hyperventilating, I had actually bitten into the oxygen mask and tore it from their hands. So there was a cop with us who stayed in the ambulance the whole time and then followed us to the ER. And then this is where things kind of get bad. So I haven't said it already, but trigger warning, from here on out, things do go downhill. So eventually we arrived at the ER, and this is normally kind of like the good part because this is where the EMTs go on their way and you get put into a quiet room and you can kind of just calm down. But that was not the case here because I hadn't been sedated in the ambulance like they wanted because they did not have enough control there. The cop that did follow us, he was very upset because I had not been complying up until that point. And when we got to the ER, that's kind of where everything went bad. Now, once again, in these episodes, I can hear what's going on, but I don't have the ability to control what my body is doing. So upon getting to the ER, I was still very upset. I did not know what was happening. I was still confused. I still thought that I was in, some sort of a nightmare. So I was still fighting as much as I could. And the ER staff, it's hard to put into words, but they were very verbally unkind. They were making fun of me. They were making fun of the sounds that I was making. They were making fun of the movements that I was exhibiting. They were laughing and just carrying on. And, to me, I think I'm already in a nightmare. So like this, I wasn't super surprised, but I was very offended, and there was really nothing I could do about it. And so they were going back and forth with the cop who was charged with staying with me because I was so violent. They will let an officer to remain with you until you're sedated. So I thought, okay, like it can't really get any worse from here. Like this is bad enough. But unfortunately it did. And I'm only telling this story because I think it needs to be spoken about. I don't think I was handled correctly, and that began with the ER staff. To make fun of someone that you don't think can hear you or understand you or do anything about it, that's so wrong. And I was just as offended as if I'd been sitting with them, over lunch break. I just couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't respond. And so, that's something I want to point out. These ER nurses, they know who they are. They may never see this video, but what they did was very unprofessional and wrong. And like I said, unfortunately, it doesn't stop there because the nurses were relatively frightened, so they were attempting to very quickly try and sedate me. They gave me one medication, which did not work. I continued to fight, and the nurses were taking turns kind of coming over and messing with me to see if I'd react or to see if I'd fight back, and laughing about that. It was like a game to them, and I'm saying this with candor because I think it deserves to be spoken about, but they were playing around. They were playing around. And when the first medication didn't work, then they decided, okay, we'll go back and we'll hit her with another medication and see if that works. During this time, they were rushing because once again, they were, I guess, concerned. And one of the nurses was not watching me closely enough, and when she attempted to come stand next to me with a uncapped syringe, I flung my hand out to the side and I actually knocked it from her hands. And in the process, the needle had scraped along the top of my fingers, so I was bleeding. And it was at that point that the lone officer who had been left there to kind of maintain the peace, if you can call it that, decided that he needed to step in. And once again, this officer knows who he is. I'm not going to share his name, badge number, or anything like that because I don't actually have that information. This is my real only way of speaking out. But what he did was really traumatizing. I had been trying to get off the gurney, so I had pulled all my restraints to the side and had kind of dipped my head over the side of the gurney. So he took it upon himself to pull my head all the way off the side of the gurney and then pin it, kind of bent over it, almost like a right angle, over the side of the gurney with his elbow on the top of my head, his opposite hand on the base of my skull, and then he placed his knee with his full weight on my neck, on the side of my neck, just beneath my ear, along that sort of area. And for those who don't know, there are a lot of very important things that are internally in that area. And when he did this, he did so with enough strength that I had been screaming and yelling and making all sorts of sounds, and my esophagus got basically closed off. I couldn't make noise anymore. All I was making were choking sounds. And at that point, blood flow had actually been hampered from getting to my brain. And I can only tell you this because I began to see spots and felt like I was going to lose consciousness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And at that time, because that didn't seem to be enough for him, he instructed the rest of the nurses to climb on top of me. So they were all pinning me down. And I was trying desperately to make noises to let him know I can't breathe, I can't get air into my lungs, I'm seeing spots. I was trying to make any sort of sound and nothing would come out. So while I'm choking, he is very, dispassionately telling me, you're fine, everything's fine, stop resisting, all the things that they're, I guess, trained to say to de-escalate. But at that point, I wasn't doing anything other than choking and wondering, is this how I die in my nightmare? Like, is this how it ends for me? Anyway, so the nurses are all on top of me at that point. He maintains his position and they're trying to inject me with a sedative. And the crazy thing is, if anybody has ever been in a similar position, when you're fighting people, your muscles are incredibly tight. So when someone attempts to jab a needle into your body, your muscles will actually push back against it. So that makes it very hard. The nurse had lost her position and then she tried to go again. And all this time, the cop is holding his position on top of my neck. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not gonna make this. This is going to probably be the end. And in my mind, I'm thinking I'll wake up, this bad dream will be over. But in reality, that was not the case. So eventually the nurses get one syringe full of medication into me, go back for a second. At this point, I've had 3 injections in the ER and have still not fallen out. So the cop gets off of me. They redo some of my restraints, which I had been slipping out of. And then they wait and they laugh and talk about their lives and kind of just hang out waiting for me to blink out until I finally become more quiet. And at that point, they decide to undo my leg restraints, transfer me from the gurney to a bed. So as soon as I felt that that was off, I started kicking and fighting again. But they had actually been planning to basically leave me alone at that point because the drugs had done enough. I wasn't as coordinated, they weren't as worried. I rolled off the bed and onto the floor, and by the time I was up and looking around, everybody had filed out and I was in one of their seclusion rooms. And honestly, for me, this is where coordination kind of came back and I was able to be back in my body, and I grabbed a blanket off of the bed and I pulled it down onto the floor and was kind of trying to figure out what to do when the sedatives started to do their work, and I kind of just basically ended up conking out on the floor, and everything is black after that for a while. In the time after that, I was transferred from the ER to the psych ward. I was processed, I was put into seclusion, and then that day and the day after, and I believe the day after that, I really basically have very little memory of. It's very spotty. Once I got to the psych ward, I had been going around doing something that I will often do even though I never remember it, which is I will kind of try to break out, but not really. I'll go around and I will kick the walls and I'll knee the walls and I'll walk very strangely. And a lot of this behavior, again, normally happens when I have absolutely no memory of it. So he had been kind of upset, over some of that, and so had come to see me, but because I was still kind of under the effects of the sedatives, at least the very first day. He came to see me, I was sleeping, and then he decided, I'll just see her tomorrow instead. No need to see her on the spot, which was the first mistake, because that meant that I wasn't going to be getting any of my medications. So he has to approve that, and without him approving the medications that I take on a daily basis every night, I could not have them there at the hospital. So I missed a night of medications when I was still on and off the sedatives. The second day, I met with him again and told him I need to be on my medications, and he said, nope, we're not going to do that here. Obviously, they weren't working, so we're just going to stop them cold turkey, which for anybody who knows is not how you wean off of medications. That's not how you stop medications at all. You have to taper them down. You can't just not take them anymore. So this guy obviously didn't know enough or wasn't being understanding enough to realize that the situation would only get worse if it wasn't addressed. For me, that meant that this would be the second day with no medications, so I was beginning to have greater symptoms. I was beginning to hallucinate very floridly. I was seeing things everywhere. I was hearing things, and it was going downhill. So I say, please speak to my psychiatrist, even though, again, some of me doesn't really remember this. I say, you need to talk to him. I need my medications. And he said, we're not going to do that. We don't want to. We're not interested. We want you to try a new medication called Prolixin. And if you don't take it, we're going to force you to take it, which they can't do, but that's what he told me. And until then, you're not having any other medication. This was ultimately where kind of like the second huge breakdown happened, because without my medication, I do not sleep, and I will be bouncing off the walls, hallucinating and talking and seeing things and hearing things until I've had my medication. So that night, I was the only patient in the entire ward that was still up, and I was dancing and singing and talking to the floor, just hallucinating, and for the first small while kind of enjoying it, in the sense that nothing bad had happened, nothing scary had happened. It was a lot of different colors and odd sensations and animals, and the floor was moving and I was seeing moving pictures, and it was okay, not in the sense that it's okay to hallucinate, but in the sense that I wasn't scared or upset yet. As the night went on, that changed dramatically, because as it normally happens, the later I go, it was starting to be 2, 3 a.m., the worse things become. And so I started to see dismembered people, and I was seeing skeletons. And when I closed my eyes, the hallucinations wouldn't go away. They'd be on the back of my eyelids, and they wouldn't stop playing. So I was in the one of the day rooms, and I had been rapidly drawing these things that I was hallucinating, these beheaded carcasses and these skulls, and I had crayons, and a one-to-one had been placed with me, so she was sitting by the door watching over me. And at some point, all of that darkness kind of got to me, and I had some really scary, explosive, intrusive thoughts. And I remember this patch significantly because I really began to break down, and I was starting to do things that were scaring the nurses. I had drawn and sort of painted some things that were very unsettling, and my one-to-one nurse had told me, listen, you need to stop this. You're seeing the psychiatrist first thing in the morning, that's enough. And I was so disturbed and so distraught, and I couldn't get the hallucinations to stop, that I just got to a point where I broke down. And I was on the floor, and I was hitting the walls, and I was screaming, and I was holding my head, and I was crying. I was seeing, for those who are familiar with some of my community posts, I was seeing my brother who had passed away. I was seeing him sitting nearby, but I couldn't touch him, and I was just crying, and I was happy to see him, but I didn't understand. And I stayed that way for quite a while, until some of the other nurses became involved, and then I was harming myself. So they felt like there's nothing we can do. We can't really get her medication. So the best thing, best possible course of action is just to sedate her for the night, and we'll deal with it tomorrow. And that's pretty much exactly what they did. They gathered a bunch of the other nurses to come in and take me by the arms and the legs and carry me to the seclusion room. And then once I was inside, their idea was to toss me on the bed. And for anybody who's been in a psych ward before, you'll know that they perform the majority of their injections on your backside. So the idea is to toss you down on the bed, everyone piles on top of you, and then they do that. Well, I have a history of my kneecaps sliding out of place. It's called subluxating patellas, and it does happen, and I have to be very careful at what position my knees are in. Obviously, none of the nurses knew this, or it was possibly on my chart and they ignored it. Either way, when they threw me down and got on top of me, my right knee had been to the side. So my kneecap slipped out of place and stayed that way until they were through with me and left the room after I had been given multiple rounds of medication. And the first thing I did, I'd been screaming the whole time, but I sat up and I was crying and I was screaming and I was holding my knee because I thought, oh my word, I'm not going to be able to get this back into place. So I was picking my knee up and I was dropping it on the bed, hoping to just kind of jolt that kneecap back into place. And when that didn't work, I started banging it with the side of my hand, trying to just knock it back into place as quickly as possible. And obviously the nurses kind of misconstrued this. They thought, what is she doing? Why is she doing that? And so they started threatening me. And they were yelling at me through the door, don't do that, don't touch that, stop self-harming. And that's, obviously that wasn't what I was doing. So once I finally did get to where I felt like my knee was sort of in place, I rolled off the side of the bed, just like I'd done before, ended up on the floor, and I lied down because I was dizzy, and then found the sedatives were working. I could not get back up. So I fell asleep there. And while I was sleeping there, I had this crazy dream that I was back home and I was living life just like normal. And when I woke up, I looked around me and I thought, what happened? I was just at home. I was living life like normal. And now I'm here. What happened? And I had very little memory up until that point. I spent the next day basically almost all day in seclusion, only let out to use the bathroom and get some food at one point. But it was just after that I started to realize, oh my word, like I dreamed. It was a dream inside a dream, if this is a dream I'm living. And started to realize, okay, I don't think this is a dream. I think this is reality, and I'm stuck here and I don't know how I'm gonna get out because I can't take my medication. I don't have the ability to say this is happening, this isn't. I'm still in a state of hallucinating and whatnot. And that was the hardest thing ever. Through another 24-hour plus period, my parents, my psychiatrists, and 2 of my therapists were able to call in and convince the psychiatrist there on site at the psych ward that I needed my medication and I needed it now. And thankfully, within a reasonable amount of time after, they all chimed in with stories of how stable I can be when I'm on my meds, and how this had just been one of what has become a yearly thing for me, is I have a psychotic break about once a year. And it had been a little bit earlier than last year, but it was not because my meds were not working. It's just because that's the reality of the illness. It's never going to be fully cured. You can have, 70 good days, but then there's going to be those 30 bad days. It's just how it happens. So that's kind of how things took a turn. That next night I was able to take my medication. They had approved of it, and it was the first night that I actually lied down in bed. I slept, and then when I woke up, I was keenly aware that I was waking up to reality. Up until that point, I had actually been experiencing symptoms of withdrawal because I had not been able to have my medications. So I was sick, I was nauseous, I had vomited a few times over the course of those first few days. And it was incredibly important that I get on my medication as quickly as possible. So once that happened, everything kind of started to more or less fall in line. I spent about a week there, and it was really the latter portion that I remember the best because the beginning was so traumatizing and my memory has blacked out everything that it feels like I can't handle. A lot of that even translated to the pain that I experienced of dislocating my kneecap, the pain in my neck, and my knees. My knees were black and blue from kicking walls and doors and whatnot. And then the kneecap that had been dislocated, it swelled up like a big red balloon and looked very concerning for quite a while. But that aside, once I was back on my medication, I started being able to go to groups. I could get out and socialize and talk to people and assist other people and offer advice. I was making all of my meals at that point, so I was eating like I was supposed to. And eventually, after about a week of time there and being back on my medication, the staff sort of finally got together and agreed, oh, well, she looks like she's doing so much better, so, now is a good time for release. But in reality, what they did was they took a bad situation where I was already kind of at rock bottom and they made it worse. And then they fixed their problem, brought me back to a baseline level, and then acted like they've solved everything, which it's very possible if they had just put me back on my medication that I would have recovered faster and there wouldn't have been that huge breakdown where I had to be sedated and kept in isolation or solitary for as long as I had been. So, in a long line of all of the things that could have gone wrong, this is probably my most traumatizing hospitalization to date, and I felt like I needed to talk about it. I needed people to know some of the, mishandling and mistreatment that I experienced, and there's not really very much that I can do about it other than share it and hope that other people learn from my experience and maybe feel like they're not alone if they've experienced similar things. Because when this does happen, it's very isolating. Nobody believes you or they doubt what you experienced. And while on one hand that does make some sort of sense, it also can be very isolating and very ostracizing. What the law enforcement officer did at that ER was wrong. It could have been life-ending, or at least, enough to have knocked me unconscious for a while, and in that state, I don't know how I would have responded to that. There was no one there to say, that's dangerous what you're doing, you need to stop. Likewise, the psychiatrist didn't know enough to know you can't just stop medications. Therefore, I had withdrawals and experienced symptoms that made me continue to believe that things weren't real, it wasn't right. And then on top of that, having nurses manhandle you to the point where you dislocate your kneecap or any other part of your body, it's huge and very painful. And so again, with this project, I'm not trying to bewail all my troubles. Please don't think that this is just me throwing a pity party. I just needed to talk about it. I needed other people to know what happened and what went on, and to be able to hear my side of the story. So that is basically the long and short of it, and I just wanted to throw in a quick bit here. There were staff members that I really did enjoy, who were very funny, who were very accommodating, who made the days pass by. Med techs that were good at what they did and easy to talk to and explain your concerns to. And one of the visiting psychiatrists who was super cool and whom I wish I had the pleasure of knowing the entire time, since his predecessor didn't really know what he was doing or maybe understand his job. I don't really know. But I wanted to note that because in all of the bad, there are always small spots of good. And if you focus on that, that's kind of how I've been getting through things. So on that note, here are a few funny things about my time in the psych ward. For one, I met another patient whom I got along really well with, and apparently I knew her during the time that I have no memory of, because when I did come to, she had already known me for a little bit of that time, and she was calling me My Little Pony because I was walking around, kicking and kneeing the doors, and she had worked with horses before, and she said, "You remind me very much of some of my horses." So I thought that would be cool to share, because long-term fans of my channel will know I got my start in My Little Pony related content and did that for quite a while before moving to more anime related content. The second thing I thought was really cool was that at some point, one of the facilitators brought a Wii gaming system into the ward and set it up in one of the cafeteria areas, and I got to play Just Dance with my one-to-one, who at the time was a male nurse and who proudly danced like 3 or 4 female songs with me, which I thought was really awesome. He was a great sport, so shout out to you. You know who you are. Obviously I can't share your name here, but you were pretty cool, and I wish that we had the chance to hang out more. Last if not least was the mystery of the ward, which was that my family brought me a blanket so that I could sleep and be warm. Because for those who know, psych wards or any hospital ward in general are very cold. And the very first night I had this blanket, my roommate had stolen it and wanted to use it. She was then moved out of my room and the blanket was returned to me, but lo and behold, a few days later, the blanket went missing again. So without knowing where it went, all of the nurses went on this ward-wide hunt to find this blanket. And during the hunt, I was being asked to look into other patients' rooms, and they were pointing out, is this yours? Is this yours? And we couldn't find it. During all of this looking, the other patients had kind of caught on. They're like, what's going on? Well, we're looking for this blanket. It's been stolen. We don't know where it went. So soon enough, the entire ward was going crazy looking for the blanket. The patients, the nurses, even some of the med techs had gotten in on looking for this, and it wasn't until probably the end of that day that one of the other patients spotted a patient with it and came and got one of the nurses and said, I found it, and here's who has it. So that was very interesting, and it led to, a little ward mystery that kind of kept everyone going, and we all had a laugh about it at the end of the day. Okay, I know this project has been really long-winded. Obviously, it's therapeutic to talk these things through, and I wanted to get them out there. I didn't want my experience to be discredited or tossed to the side. I wanted to have a verbal archive of what happened and what I experienced. And to the people involved who mishandled things, I don't hold it against you. I obviously forgive you, but you've got to do better. The next patient who that cop has his knee on might not make it. The next patient whose meds get cut off might go into withdrawals and try to end their life. The next patient who has a limb dislocated could experience complications that aren't taken care of like they should be in the time that they should be. you just never know. And so with this project, I hope to just get this information out there, share a little bit of my story with you, give a little bit of information on some of the signs and symptoms that can lead up to an experience like this, and just share my thoughts. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for listening to my story and taking the time to watch this video and see the kind of vent art that I created off of it. I love you guys so much. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you are having a wonderful day and that this didn't dampen the mood. Remember, focus on the good at the end of the video. That's the take-home message. All right, guys, I love you all. Stay awesome and be safe. This is Miles signing off. Bye.